Unknown. Unknown. Introduction to Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. Imagine a world where there is no war, no suffering, no poverty. A world where everyone is happy. But what if that happiness comes at the cost of individuality, of free thought, of real emotion? What if that world is not a utopia, but a carefully engineered illusion? Welcome to Brave New World, a vision of the future written by Aldous Huxley in 1932. Unlike Orwell's 1984, which depicts a world controlled through fear and oppression, Huxley's dystopia is built on pleasure, distraction, and genetic engineering. Instead of terrorizing its people, the world state keeps them content, entertained, and chemically sedated. This is a society where stability is valued above all else, where everyone has a role, a purpose, and no reason to question it. The story follows Bernard Marx, a man who, despite living in this perfect world, feels out of place. Unlike his peers, he questions the system, feels restless, and desires something more. But in a world designed to eliminate unhappiness, there is no room for rebels. So let's enter the world state, where everyone belongs to everyone, where emotions are controlled, and where being unhappy is the greatest crime of all. Chapter 1. The Perfect Society. The year is AF 632, meaning it has been 632 years since the birth of Henry Ford, whose principles of mass production shaped the entire world. Human beings are no longer born naturally. Instead, they are engineered in massive hatchery and conditioning centers, where embryos are carefully designed for their predetermined caste. The 5 castes are alphas, the elite, the leaders, intelligent and physically strong. Betas, skilled professionals and managers. Gammas, routine workers with limited intelligence. Deltas, mass laborers, conditioned for obedience. Epsilons, the lowest caste, deliberately stunted in intelligence to perform the simplest tasks. Each human is conditioned from birth to love their role. They are exposed to subliminal messages while they sleep, repeated thousands of times until they become absolute truths. They are taught to fear solitude, to embrace pleasure, and to never question the system. The Hatchery and Conditioning Center is a vast industrial facility where embryos are mass-produced and modified. Oxygen deprivation and chemical treatments determine intelligence levels. By the time they are decanted, artificially born, their entire destiny is predetermined. Inside the hatchery, students are led by the director, who proudly explains how human beings are created to serve a stable, conflict-free society. As they walk through the different rooms, they witness the assembly line of human life. The Bokanovsky process, used for the lower castes, forces embryos to divide into dozens of identical clones, ensuring a society of uniform workers with no individuality. But genetic engineering is only the beginning. Once born, children undergo neo-Pavlovian conditioning, a process designed to shape their instincts. Babies are shocked with electricity whenever they reach for books or flowers, ensuring that future laborers never develop curiosity or a love for nature. Instead, they are taught to crave mindless work, entertainment, and consumer goods. The world state operates on 3 key principles. Community. Everyone works together in harmony, with no individuality. Identity. Each person has a predefined role and is conditioned to love it. Stability. Conflict is eliminated, and happiness is maintained at all costs. To further ensure stability, sleep teaching, or hypnopedia is used to instill unquestionable loyalty to the system. Every night, children hear phrases like, "Everyone belongs to everyone else." "A gram is better than a dam," encouraging drug use. "Ending is better than mending," promoting consumerism. These messages are repeated thousands of times, embedding them so deeply into the subconscious that citizens never question them. And if anyone does feel unhappy, there's Soma, a perfect drug that provides instant euphoria, ensuring no one ever experiences pain, sadness, or dissatisfaction. Religion, philosophy, and art have been abandoned, replaced with endless entertainment, consumerism, and sexual indulgence. Family structures are non-existent. People are encouraged to avoid attachments, ensuring that love, grief, and deep emotions never threaten stability. Sex is casual, relationships are meaningless, and emotional depth is discouraged. People engage in feelies, movies that provide full sensory experiences, and any sign of distress can be easily cured with a dose of soma. To the citizens of the world state, this is paradise. They do not mourn, do not desire, do not question. But beneath the surface of this perfect society, something unsettling lurks. Because in order to achieve absolute stability, the world state has removed what makes us human, and not everyone is satisfied. Chapter 2. Bernard Marx, the Outsider. Bernard Marx is an alpha, but something about him is different. Unlike his fellow alphas, who are strong, confident, and perfectly molded, Bernard is physically smaller, weaker, and more self-conscious. He doesn't look like a leader. He doesn't act like one either, and for that, he is mocked behind his back. But Bernard's real problem isn't his stature. It's his mind. Unlike others, he does not blindly accept the world around him. He feels isolated, troubled by the emptiness of a society built on pleasure. While others enjoy endless distractions, orgies, entertainment, and soma-fueled bliss, Bernard prefers solitude. He despises the hypnopedic conditioning that dictates everyone's thoughts. He longs for something real, something beyond the artificial happiness of the world state. His dissatisfaction is dangerous. He questions the purpose of soma, the efficiency of mass production, and the superficiality of relationships. But in a world where happiness is mandatory, even asking such questions is suspicious. His only confidant is Helmholtz Watson, another alpha who, despite his success, also feels something is missing. But while Helmholtz seeks deeper meaning, Bernard is consumed by his insecurities. He resents his position and craves recognition, making him both a rebel and a hypocrite. Everything changes when Bernard is given the opportunity to visit the savage reservations, one of the few places left where people still live naturally, outside the reach of the world state. He does not yet realize that this journey will change everything. Chapter 3. The Savage. The savage reservation was unlike anything Bernard or Lenina had ever seen. The air was thick with dust, the land dry and cracked beneath the scorching sun. There were no sleek glass buildings, no soothing hum of hypnopedic voices, no endless distractions of feelies and soma. Instead, there was raw life, chaotic, unfiltered, and painfully real. As their transport landed, Bernard and Lenina stepped into an unfamiliar world. The people here did not move with engineered grace, nor did they smile with conditioned politeness. They were aged, wrinkled, flawed. Children ran barefoot, their laughter uncontrolled and wild. Men and women carried the weight of time in their faces, in their expressions. It was a shocking sight to Lenina, who had never seen an elderly person before. Everyone in the world state died young, their bodies kept in pristine condition until the very end. Disgusted, Lenina clutched Bernard's arm. "This is horrible," she whispered. "Why do they let themselves grow old?" Bernard, however, was fascinated. There was something about this place that intrigued him. A rawness, a truth that the world state had erased long ago. Their guide led them through the village, explaining its traditions. The savages, as they were called, lived according to old ways, without technology, without genetic engineering, without soma. They worked, they struggled, they experienced pain. They also loved, mourned, and remembered. It was here that Bernard and Lenina met John, the boy who would change everything. John was different from the others. His skin was lighter, his features distinct. He spoke their language fluently, but carried himself like an outsider, never fully belonging to the savage world. His mother, Linda, had once been a citizen of the world state, but she had been stranded here years ago, left to survive in a world she did not understand. She had raised John using what little she remembered of civilization, but John had never truly known his mother's world. He had, however, known Shakespeare. In his hands, John held a tattered copy of the complete works of William Shakespeare, a book that had become his teacher, his guide, his only true window into the world beyond the reservation. He spoke of honor, of love, of passion, concepts that had long since been erased from the world state's vocabulary. As he spoke, Bernard felt something stir within him. For the first time, he saw proof that a different way of life existed, one where people felt deeply, questioned authority, and sought meaning beyond pleasure. John, in turn, was fascinated by Bernard and Lenina. He had grown up hearing stories of the world state from his mother, stories of a place where no one suffered, where every desire was instantly fulfilled. He had dreamed of visiting it, of finding his place in the world his mother came from. Bernard saw an opportunity. Bringing John back to civilization would make him important. He was no longer just an awkward, disliked alpha. He had found something unique, something no one else had. A savage, a spectacle, a living contradiction to everything the world state stood for. He offered to take John back with them. John accepted. As they prepared to leave, Linda begged Bernard to take her as well. She had spent years being mocked by the savages, rejected for her promiscuity, for her inability to understand family and faith. She longed to return to the comfort of Soma, to the world where she belonged. Bernard agreed, though he knew that Linda was not the prize. John was. The savage would be his ticket to power, his way of proving his worth in a society that had always dismissed him. As their transport lifted off, John stared out the window at the receding land, his home fading beneath him. He was leaving the only world he had ever known, stepping into the unknown. Little did he realize. He was walking into a nightmare. Chapter 4. John in the World State. The trip back to the world state was silent. Bernard, eager for the recognition he knew John would bring him, was lost in thought. Lenina, disturbed by the primitive world she had just witnessed, took multiple doses of Soma to calm herself. And John, overwhelmed with anticipation, stared out the window, his heart pounding with excitement and fear. When they arrived, John's first sight of civilization was breathtaking. Enormous towers of glass and steel, moving sidewalks, flying transports, and bright neon lights that stretched endlessly. The streets were immaculate. People moved in perfect synchronization, and everything smelled unnaturally clean. It was a world of absolute order. John marveled at it all. "Oh, brave new world," he whispered, quoting Shakespeare. "That has such people in it." Bernard smirked. "You'll see soon enough." News of John's arrival spread quickly. The director had planned to exile Bernard for his rebellious tendencies, but Bernard turned the tables on him, publicly exposing that the director was John's father. A scandalous fact in a society where reproduction was artificial and biological parenthood was taboo. The director, humiliated, resigned in disgrace. Suddenly, Bernard was a hero. Everyone wanted to meet the savage. He was an exotic curiosity, something unheard of in the world state. Parties were thrown. Influential alphas sought Bernard's company, and for the first time in his life, he was important. But John did not fit in. The artificiality of the world state unsettled him. The people were too perfect, their emotions too shallow. The society revolved around endless pleasure, orgies, feelies, consumerism, and soma-fueled bliss. But John found it all empty. They knew nothing of real love, of real pain, of real sacrifice. To John, they were not truly alive. Lenina, however, was drawn to him. She saw in John something she had never encountered: passion, depth, a sense of something greater than pleasure. She pursued him, but John recoiled from her advances. He spoke of chastity, of honor, of true love, things Lenina did not understand. In her world, everyone belonged to everyone else. The idea of devotion to one person was absurd. Bernard, meanwhile, reveled in his newfound popularity, enjoying the luxuries of success. He became arrogant, dismissing Helmholtz and anyone who reminded him of his past insecurities. But deep down, he knew his status was fragile. He was not respected, only tolerated because he had John, the savage. John, disillusioned by what he saw, began withdrawing, isolating himself from the hedonistic society around him. He sought meaning in the ancient texts of Shakespeare, clinging to words that spoke of a world that no longer existed. But the more he resisted the world state, the more fascinated the citizens became. They did not see him as a person. They saw him as entertainment. And soon, John would realize he was nothing more than a spectacle in their never-ending pursuit of pleasure. Chapter 5. The Illusion of Happiness. At first, John was overwhelmed by the sheer spectacle of the world state. The people, the lights, the efficiency of everything. It was dazzling, unlike anything he had ever imagined. But as the days passed, his wonder faded, replaced by an uneasy realization. This world was hollow. Everywhere he looked, he saw a society dedicated to avoiding discomfort at all costs. If someone felt the slightest bit anxious, they took soma. If they wanted pleasure, they went to a feelie, where movies didn't just show images but made the audience feel everything. Sex was casual, relationships meaningless, emotions carefully controlled. John was repulsed. He had grown up believing in love, sacrifice, and deep human connections, values shaped by the words of Shakespeare. But here, those ideas were seen as ridiculous relics of the past. Bernard continued to ride the wave of popularity that John had brought him. The savage was invited to every high-profile gathering, treated as an exotic curiosity. People did not care who John was. They cared about the spectacle of him. His words, his disgust, his outbursts. They were all part of the entertainment. One night, at an extravagant party thrown in John's honor, the highest-ranking members of society gathered, eager to meet the famous savage. But John, disgusted by the artificiality of it all, refused to leave his room. He would not perform for them like some trained animal. The guests were furious. Bernard, whose fragile social status relied on John's presence, was humiliated. The crowd turned on him instantly. His new status, built entirely on borrowed prestige, collapsed overnight. He was once again an outsider. Meanwhile, Lenina, unable to understand John's rejection of her advances, was left confused and heartbroken. She had never encountered a man who didn't want her. It went against everything she had been taught. In desperation, she turned to soma, drowning her emotions in artificial bliss. John, increasingly isolated, found a rare kindred spirit in Helmholtz Watson, an alpha plus like Bernard, but vastly different. Helmholtz, despite his high status, had grown disillusioned with the emptiness of the world state. He longed for something deeper, something with real meaning. Unlike Bernard, he did not seek fame or validation. He sought truth. Together, John and Helmholtz spoke of passion, of art, of suffering, the things the world state had erased. John read Shakespeare to him, and for the first time, Helmholtz understood what it meant to feel. But their conversations were dangerous. The world state could tolerate entertainment, but it could not tolerate dissent. And John's rejection of the system was a threat that could not be ignored. As John's frustration grew, so did his anger. He despised the way people lived, the way they avoided pain, the way they had turned human existence into a meaningless pursuit of pleasure. Then came the breaking point. One day, John visited the hospital where his mother, Linda, was dying. She had returned to the world state only to spend her final days in a soma-induced haze, completely detached from reality. She barely recognized John, her mind too fogged by the drug to even acknowledge her own son. As John held her hand, begging her to remember him, she simply smiled, whispering, "Soma, more soma." And then, she was gone. John, overwhelmed with grief, turned to see a group of Delta workers watching dispassionately. They had no reaction to death. They had been conditioned to see it as a natural process, nothing to mourn, nothing to feel. They simply waited for the body to be taken away so they could return to their work. John's grief turned to rage. He grabbed the bottle of soma they had brought with them and threw it to the ground. "Don't you see? This is poison," he shouted. "It's killing you. It's taking away everything that makes you human." The Deltas, confused, hesitated. But as John began physically destroying the soma, trying to wake them up from their controlled stupor, panic spread. The disruption was too much. An alarm was triggered. The authorities arrived within minutes. John had crossed a line. His rebellion had begun. Chapter 6. The Breaking Point. The moment the alarm sounded, the illusion of harmony shattered. John's desperate attempt to wake up the people had turned into a riot. Delta workers, confused and frightened, watched as their precious soma supplies spilled across the floor. Some panicked, others grew violent. They had been conditioned to believe that life without soma was unbearable. The police arrived in force, but there were no weapons, no violence, only hypnopedic commands and clouds of soma vapor pumped into the air. Within moments, the crowd became docile again, their panic replaced by an eerie calm. John, gasping for air, realized it was over. The world state did not need brute force to control its people. It only needed pleasure and sedation. Bernard and Helmholtz arrived just in time to see John surrounded by authorities. Bernard, terrified, hesitated. Should he help John? Should he run? But Helmholtz did not hesitate. He jumped into the fight, striking a policeman, refusing to let his friend stand alone. The rebellion lasted only minutes. John, Helmholtz, and Bernard were arrested and taken to the office of Mustafa Mond, one of the 10 world controllers, the most powerful men in the world state. Mond studied them, his expression calm, almost amused. He was not angry, nor did he seem surprised. He had seen this before. "You are an intelligent man, John," he said. "But intelligence does not mean wisdom." John's fists clenched. "You have turned human beings into slaves." "We have freed them from suffering," Mond corrected. "From struggle, from fear, from loss. They are happy." Helmholtz spoke up. "But at what cost? What about art? What about passion? What about meaning?" Mond smiled. "You think those things matter? Tell me, would you rather have Shakespeare or happiness?" John's voice was raw. "You can't have happiness without suffering, without struggle, without love, without loss. What you have isn't life. It's an empty dream." Mond sighed, almost regretful. "You are right, but stability is more important." He turned to Bernard. "As for you, you are a disappointment. You don't belong here, but you don't belong with them either." Bernard, trembling, begged. "I didn't mean... I was just... Please, don't send me away." Mond waved a hand. "You will be sent to an island, a place where misfits like you can live freely, away from the rest of civilization." Bernard collapsed, sobbing. He had spent his life trying to fit in, and now he was banished from the only world he had ever known. Helmholtz, however, smiled. "That doesn't sound so bad." John, on the other hand, would not be exiled. No, Mon said. You are far too valuable. You are an experiment now. John had no idea what that meant. But soon, he would learn. The nightmare was not over. It was just beginning. Chapter 7. The Tragic End. John was not sent to an island like Bernard or Helmholtz. He was not given the freedom to exist outside of the world state. Instead, he was placed under quiet observation. A living experiment in what happened when a mind shaped by suffering was thrown into a world designed to erase it. He could not escape the attention. Everywhere he went, people followed. They treated him like a spectacle, a living curiosity. The savage had become the ultimate entertainment. His rejection of pleasure fascinated them. His sorrow was something to be studied, his anger a novelty. John fled. He could no longer bear the endless stares, the artificial smiles, the empty minds that surrounded him. He left the city and found refuge in a deserted lighthouse on the outskirts of civilization. Alone, at last. Here he tried to cleanse himself. He whipped himself for his sins, for his desires, for his failure to save his mother. He prayed for redemption in a world where no gods existed. He sought pain to remind himself that he was still alive. But solitude would not last. The people of the world state had never seen anything like him. They found him, watched him, laughed at him. They turned his suffering into entertainment, just as they had turned his presence into a spectacle before. And then, Lenina came. She approached him, smiling, soft, her eyes filled with longing. She had been conditioned to believe that everyone should belong to everyone else, that no one should deny pleasure. And John, torn between desire and hatred, broke. He struck her. Rage, guilt, and longing consumed him. He was no longer in control. The people cheered. This was the climax of the show they had waited for. Violence, passion, raw human emotion. That night they came in droves. They brought soma, music, and indulgence. They danced around him, celebrating their perfect world, mocking his pain. John, overwhelmed, fell into the chaos. He lost himself, he gave in. He swallowed the drug, he laughed, he wept, he surrendered. And when the morning came, he awoke to the weight of it all. The shame, the emptiness, the undeniable truth that he had become what he swore he never would be. In the silence of the lighthouse, away from the eyes of the world, John made his final choice. The next morning, the crowd returned, eager to see what their savage would do next. They found him hanging from the rafters. The experiment was over. Final thoughts. John's story is a tragedy, not just because of his death, but because of what it reveals about human nature. Brave New World is not a warning about an oppressive government, but about a society that has embraced its own chains, that has chosen pleasure over meaning, comfort over freedom, and illusion over truth. In the end, John could not exist in a world that had erased pain, because without pain, there is no joy. Without struggle, there is no triumph. Without love, there is no life. And the most chilling truth of all, the people of the world state did not murder John. They simply watched him destroy himself.